A human mechanic took 12 plasma blasts for a vampire princess. Then woke beside elite vampire women. The smell of ionized air was thick enough to choke on. "Stay down!" Wesley roared, shoving the terrified girl beneath the reinforced steel chassis of the hydraulic lift. The garage doors blew inward, raining sparks and shattered concrete. He didn't know she was Alyssa of the Night Court. He just saw a girl in a torn evening gown, bleeding on his oil-stained floor. The first plasma bolt seared through his shoulder, dropping him to his knees. The second cracked his ribs. By the fifth, his vision swam in blinding violet light. He counted 12 agonizing, skin-melting impacts before the world finally faded. He died a grease-stained mechanic on a cold floor. Or so he thought. The rain outside sounded like a handful of gravel being thrown against the corrugated tin roof of the garage. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour that belonged only to stray dogs, insomniacs, and men who preferred the company of engines to people. Wesley wiped a streak of black grease from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand. He was lying on a creeper under the belly of an old, combustion engine muscle car. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink of his socket wrenched the only sound competing with the downpour. The air inside the shop was a comforting blend of stale coffee, motor oil, and old dust. It was his sanctuary, a quiet, dirty corner of a city that was rapidly outgrowing mechanics like him. Then, the proximity alarm at the edge of his lot chimed, a sharp, digital chirp that cut through the white noise of the storm. Wesley paused, the wrench freezing in his hand. No one came to the industrial district at 2 a.m. looking for an oil change. He rolled out from beneath the chassis, his boots hitting the concrete with a soft thud. He grabbed a heavy iron tire iron from the workbench, an old habit from a life he'd tried to leave behind in the military surplus yards, and walked toward the rolling bay doors. Before he could hit the motorized switch, the heavy steel door shuddered. A fist was pounding against it. Frantic. Desperate. Wesley unlocked the side access door and pulled it open. She practically fell inside. Wesley caught her by instinct, his grease-stained hands gripping a sodden, wildly expensive silk dress. She was freezing, her skin the color of polished porcelain, wet black hair plastered to the sides of her face. She couldn't have been older than her mid-20s, but her eyes, wide, striking, and an unnatural shade of fractured amethyst, held a centuries-old kind of terror. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of the rain. "They're right behind me." "Who?" Wesley asked, his eyes darting to the rain-slicked street outside. There was no car, no footsteps, just the shadows of the alleyways. "Look, lady, I don't want any trouble." "You have to hide me," she interrupted, her grip on his canvas jacket surprisingly strong. Her nails dug through the tough fabric, pressing into his skin. "If they find me, they will burn this entire block to ash. Hide me, now." Wesley didn't know her. He didn't know that the woman shaking in his arms was Alyssa, the second in line to the ruling vampire syndicate that silently governed the eastern seaboard. He only saw a woman running for her life. And Wesley had a fatal flaw. He couldn't stand by and watch the wolves tear apart the lamb. "Back there," Wesley said, gesturing to the heavy, reinforced steel bay where he kept the high-pressure hydraulics. "Behind the compressor. Keep your head down." Alyssa didn't hesitate. She darted into the shadows of the garage, her movements unnaturally fluid, practically gliding over the oil-slicked floor. Wesley barely had time to lock the side door and turn around when the front of his shop exploded. It wasn't a chemical bomb. It was a localized pulse of raw, kinetic plasma. The reinforced rolling door didn't just break, it liquefied, glowing a violent, blinding violet before blowing inward in a shower of molten shrapnel. The shockwave threw Wesley backward. He slammed into the side of a tool cabinet. The wind knocked completely out of his lungs. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. Through the smoke and the lingering glow of melted steel, 3 figures walked into the garage. They wore matte black tactical gear, their faces obscured by smooth, featureless helmets. In their hands, they held heavy, brutalist rifles that hummed with charging energy. Hunters, corporate mercenaries, or something far worse. "Target acquired," one of them said, his voice modulated into a harsh, metallic rasp. The hunter raised his rifle, aiming not at Wesley, but past him, straight toward the compressor where Alyssa was hiding. Wesley didn't think. If he had thought, he would have stayed down. He would have played dead. Instead, the instinct that had gotten him a chest full of medals and a dishonorable discharge flared to life. He grabbed the tire iron, pushed off the cabinet, and lunged. "Hey!" Wesley roared, throwing the heavy iron bar with all his strength. It struck the lead hunter squarely in the visor, cracking the glass and staggering him backward. The distraction worked. All 3 rifles pivoted to the mechanic. "Obstruction," the second hunter droned. "Clear it." Wesley dove for the heavy steel chassis of the hydraulic lift, just as the first shot fired. The plasma bolt caught him in the left shoulder. It didn't feel like a bullet. It felt like someone had driven a red-hot railroad spike through his flesh and left it there to burn. Wesley screamed, his vision whiting out as the sheer, impossible heat cauterized the wound instantly, vaporizing muscle and bone. He hit the floor hard, scrambling backward as the second bolt struck his right thigh, tearing through his work pants and leaving a smoking, blackened crater in his leg. "Stay down!" Wesley yelled back toward the compressor, his voice ragged, tasting copper and ash. The hunters advanced slowly, systematically. They weren't rushing. They were exterminators dealing with an insect. Wesley dragged himself up, putting his body directly between the advancing rifles and the shadows where Alyssa crouched. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby cart, gripping it with a trembling, blood-slicked hand. The third shot hit him square in the ribs. He felt the bone crack and cave under the kinetic force, the heat searing his lungs. He fell to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. 4, 5, 6. The bolts hit him in rapid succession. His left arm went entirely numb. His side felt like it had been submerged in lava. He couldn't breathe. The smell of his own burning flesh filled his nostrils, thick and sickening. He looked back over his shoulder. Through the smoke, he saw Alyssa. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing up, her eyes glowing with a terrifying, primal light, her fangs elongated. She looked at him, really looked at him, with an expression of absolute, shattered disbelief. Why was he standing there? Why was a fragile, mortal human letting himself be torn apart for her? 7, 8, 9. Wesley collapsed onto his side, his face pressing into the cold, oil-stained concrete. The pain was so absolute that his nervous system began to shut down, replacing the agony with a strange, floating cold. The violet flashes illuminated the garage in bursts like a macabre strobe light. 10, 11. A bolt grazed his temple, burning away the hair and scorching his skull. The world was fading. The sounds of the storm outside vanished, replaced by a deep, rushing silence. Through his half-closed, rapidly dimming eyes, he saw a blur of motion. Alyssa didn't run. She moved faster than a human eye could track, launching herself over Wesley's broken body, a blur of silk and lethal, predatory fury. The 12th blast hit Wesley squarely in the center of his chest. Then, there was only darkness. Waking up was not a sudden gasp of breath or a dramatic opening of the eyes. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through a swamp of fractured consciousness. First came the smell. Gone was the familiar, comforting scent of motor oil and metallic dust. Instead, Wesley inhaled the crisp, sterile scent of ozone, polished silver, and the heavy, intoxicating perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Next came the sensation of touch. He expected the cold, gritty concrete of his garage floor. Instead, he felt smooth, impossibly soft fabric beneath him. Silk, high thread count velvet. His body felt heavy, as if his bones had been replaced with lead, and a dull, throbbing heat pulsed with every beat of his heart. He tried to open his eyes. The lids felt like sandpaper. When he finally managed to part them, the light was muted, cast in low, ambient hues of deep crimson and charcoal. He wasn't in a hospital. Hospitals were bright, chaotic, and smelled of bleach. He was in a massive, vaulted bedchamber. The walls were constructed of dark, polished stone, lined with intricate silver filigree that seemed to catch and trap the low light. The bed he lay in was massive, an antique four-poster draped in dark linens. Wesley tried to move his hand. A sharp, localized pain shot up his arm. He looked down and saw an IV line, but it wasn't plastic. It was a thin, flexible tube of what looked like spun glass and silver, feeding a translucent, glowing crimson fluid into his veins. What the hell? His heart rate is elevating. The voice was female, sharp, and aristocratic. It sounded like it was coming from the foot of the bed. Wesley slowly turned his head. His neck cracked, the muscles stiff and protesting. Standing a few feet away were 3 women. Calling them beautiful would have been an insulting understatement. They were striking in a way that triggered a deep, primal alarm bell in the back of Wesley's brain. It was the beauty of a storm, or a drawn blade. The one who had spoken stood in the center. She was tall, dressed in a tailored, militaristic uniform of black leather and silver accents. Her hair was a shock of platinum blonde, pulled back into a severe braid. But it was her eyes that made Wesley's breath hitch. They were a piercing, inhuman shade of crimson. "Of course it's elevating," Genevieve, a second woman, said. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by the bed, holding a sleek, glowing tablet. She wore a pristine white coat over a dark dress. Her hair was dark, her skin pale, and her eyes a cold, calculating silver. "He is experiencing the psychological trauma of waking up from what should have been a fatal biological event. He took 12 Class 4 plasma impacts, Ilara," the third woman muttered. She leaned against the stone wall, casually flipping a silver combat knife between her fingers. Humans turn to ash after 2. 3, if they're wearing heavy armor. This grease monkey took 12 in street clothes. Wesley tried to speak. His throat was as dry as the Mojave. He opened his mouth, but only a dry rasp came out. The woman in the white coat, Ilara, stood up and approached the bed. She moved without making a single sound. No rustle of fabric, no footfall. 1 second she was at the chair, the next she was looming over him. She poured a glass of water from a silver pitcher on the nightstand and held it to his lips. "Drink slowly. Your internal organs have spent the last 48 hours rapidly regenerating. Your throat will be raw." Wesley drank eagerly, the cool water soothing the burning in his esophagus. When he pulled back, he coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made his chest flare with phantom pain. "Where?" Wesley croaked, his voice gravelly. "Where am I?" The tall blonde, Genevieve, stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back. She looked down at him, with an expression that hovered between mild curiosity and deep disdain. "You are in the sanctum of the Night Court," Genevieve said, her voice echoing slightly in the large room. a place no living mortal has ever seen, let alone rested within. Wesley blinked, his exhausted brain struggling to process the words. The Night Court? What is this? Some kind of cult? The woman with the knife stopped flipping it. A low, vibrating growl hummed in her chest, a sound that made the hairs on Wesley's arms stand up. It sounded like a large, predatory cat. Ilara held up a hand, silencing the other woman. She looked down at Wesley, her silver eyes analytical. Tell me, human, what is the last thing you remember? Wesley closed his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The rain, the girl, the blinding violet light, the smell of burning flesh. He remembered his ribs caving in. He remembered dying. The garage, Wesley whispered, his heart monitor beeping faster, the tempo echoing in the quiet room. There were guys with plasma rifles. He looked up at Ilara, panic beginning to break through the fog of the narcotics. There was a girl. Alyssa, is she? The three women exchanged a look. It was a micro-expression, a silent conversation passing between them in the span of a millisecond. Her Highness is entirely unharmed, Genevieve said, the absolute rigidness of her posture faltering for just a fraction of a second. Thanks, inexplicably to you. Wesley frowned, trying to sit up. The pain in his chest flared, forcing him back down into the silk pillows. Her Highness? Look, ladies, I don't know what kind of LARPing you're doing, but I need to get to a real hospital. My ribs are completely shattered. I took a plasma bolt to the... He stopped. With trembling fingers, Wesley reached up to his chest. He pulled the collar of the loose, black silk shirt they had dressed him in down. Where there should have been a gaping, charred crater over his heart, there was only smooth, pale skin. The only sign that anything had happened was a web of faint, silvery scars radiating outward from the center of his chest, looking like veins of lightning trapped under his flesh. Wesley stared at his own chest, his breathing turning shallow and fast. He touched his thigh. Intact. His shoulder. Intact. That's impossible, Wesley breathed. Under normal physiological parameters, yes, Ilara said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. You suffered third-degree burns over 40% of your body. Total collapse of the left lung. Liquefaction of 3 ribs. Massive cardiac trauma. You arrived here as a corpse, mechanic. Then how am I alive? Wesley demanded, looking between the 3 women. Genevieve stepped closer to the bed, her crimson eyes locking onto his. When she spoke, the reality of the situation finally settled over Wesley, like a suffocating blanket. As she formed her words, he saw the subtle glint of elongated, razor-sharp canines pressing against her lower lip. Because, human, Genevieve said coldly, the princess commanded it. And in this court, a royal command can defy even death. The heavy oak doors of the bedchamber swung open without a creak. The 3 elite guards immediately snapped to attention, their posture so rigid they looked like statues carved from marble. Genevieve bowed her head, her hand resting on the hilt of a curved sword at her hip. Wesley pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing as a dull ache radiated from the silver scars on his chest. Alyssa walked into the room. She looked entirely different from the terrified, rain-soaked girl who had stumbled into his garage. The torn silk dress was gone, replaced by a tailored, immaculate suit of deep burgundy. Her raven hair was sleek and perfectly styled. But it was her demeanor that was most striking. The vulnerability was completely stripped away. She radiated an aura of absolute, suffocating authority. She looked like a queen. Yet, when her amethyst eyes locked onto Wesley, the cold facade cracked, just a hairline fracture. "Leave us," Alyssa said, Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that left no room for argument. "Highness," Genevieve protested, taking a half step forward. "He is an unknown variable. A mortal. It is against protocol to leave you unsecured with—" "Genevieve," Alyssa interrupted, not raising her voice, but the sudden drop in temperature in the room was palpable. "I will not repeat myself." Genevieve's jaw tightened. She shot Wesley a look that promised a very slow, very painful dismemberment if he so much as breathed incorrectly. "As you command." The three women filed out of the room in total silence. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving Wesley alone with the woman he had died for. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic beep of the monitor, tracking Wesley's erratic heart rate. He felt incredibly small in the massive bed, acutely aware of his own mortality in the presence of whatever she truly was. Alyssa slowly walked toward the bed. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked at him with an intensity that made Wesley want to look away, but he held her gaze. "You should be Ash," Alyssa said finally. Her voice was tight, strained. "I drink a lot of milk," Wesley replied, the sarcastic defense mechanism slipping out before he could stop it. Alyssa didn't smile. She just stared at the silver scars peeking out from the collar of his shirt. "I watched the plasma melt your ribs. I watched your heart stop on the floor of your garage. You knew what those weapons were. You knew they were lethal. Why did you stand in front of me?" Wesley shifted uncomfortably against the pillows. He looked down at his hands. They were clean. The grease and grime of his entire life had been scrubbed away, leaving his skin looking strangely raw. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now. I couldn't watch them kill you. I've spent my whole life fixing broken things. When I saw you, you looked broken. I guess I just reacted." "You reacted," Alyssa repeated, as if the concept was entirely alien to her. "You threw your life away for a stranger on an impulse?" "It worked out, didn't it?" Wesley said, gesturing broadly to the luxurious room. "I'm here. I'm breathing. Though I'm pretty sure my medical insurance doesn't cover whatever high-end voodoo your doctor friend used on me." Alyssa took a step closer. The scent of jasmine grew stronger, intoxicating and heavy. It wasn't voodoo, and Ilara's medical expertise, while unparalleled, could not bring back a dead human. Your organs were failing. Your blood was boiling in your veins. Wesley frowned, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "Then how did I heal?" Alyssa reached out. Her hand hovered over his chest, not quite touching him. Her fingers were trembling slightly. "Vampire physiology is built on regeneration. Our blood is a catalyst. It heals, it sustains." Wesley's eyes widened as the implication set in. He looked at the IV line, the glowing crimson fluid pumping into his arm. "You gave me your blood?" "A standard transfusion would have done nothing but delay your death," Alyssa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "To reconstruct cellular damage of that magnitude, you didn't just need vampire blood. You needed sovereign blood, royal blood." Wesley swallowed hard. "Okay, so, thank you. We're even." "Even?" Alyssa let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "Wesley, in our world, blood is not a commodity. It is a binding contract. A sovereign does not bleed for a mortal. It is forbidden by the oldest laws of the Syndicate. By doing what I did to save your life, I didn't just break the law, I chained you to me." "Chained me?" Wesley tried to sit up further, panic spiking. "Listen, lady, I don't want to be chained to anybody. I just want to go back to my shop, fix my door, and pretend none of this—" "Your shop is gone," Alyssa said softly. The hunters incinerated the entire block to cover their tracks. You have no home to go back to." Wesley froze. The garage, his tools, the old Mustang, his entire life burned to slag. He slumped back against the pillows, staring blankly at the stone ceiling. "I owe you a life debt," Alyssa said, her tone shifting, becoming formal and heavy with ancient tradition. "You stepped between me and the sun. You took the fire meant for the crown. In return, I pulled you back from the abyss." She finally closed the distance, her cool, impossibly smooth hand resting over his heart. Wesley could feel the warmth of her touch seeping through his skin, a strange, electric connection pulling taut between them. "You are no longer just a mechanic, Wesley," Alyssa whispered, her amethyst eyes locking onto his with terrifying possessiveness. "My blood is in your veins. That makes you a target for every enemy I have, and it makes you mine to protect." Wesley looked at the beautiful, terrifying vampire princess leaning over him. He felt the silver scars on his chest pulse in time with her heartbeat, rather than his own. He had survived 12 plasma blasts. But as he looked into Alyssa's eyes, he realized the real danger had only just begun. The silence that followed Alyssa's departure was thick enough to carve. Wesley remained in the massive antique bed long after the heavy oak doors had clicked shut behind her, staring at the vaulted ceiling. "Mine to protect." The words echoed in his skull, overlapping with the phantom memory of his bones liquefying under the plasma barrage. He swung his legs over the edge of the mattress. The floor was cold, polished black marble that sent a sudden, shocking jolt of clarity up his spine. As he stood, a wave of vertigo hit him, but it wasn't the clumsy, sickening dizziness of a human recovering from trauma. It was sharp, hyper-focused. He gripped the silver bedpost to steady himself, and as his fingers closed around the metal, the post groaned. Wesley looked down in alarm. The thick, solid silver had indented beneath his grip. The metal was warped, bearing the perfect impression of his thumb and forefinger. He let go instantly, staring at his hands. They were the same hands he'd had for 30 years, calloused, scarred from slipped wrenches and hot exhaust pipes. But the blood pumping beneath the skin felt different. It felt hot, restless. He took a hesitant step toward the center of the room, and that was when the noise hit him. It wasn't a loud crash, but a terrifying layering of subtle sounds that his brain suddenly had access to. He could hear the low, rhythmic hum of the building's electrical grid behind the stone walls. He could hear the faint, muffled swish of silk rubbing against leather out in the hallway. Most unnerving of all, he could hear a steady, syncopated drumming. Thump, 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 thump. It took him a moment to realize he was listening to the heartbeats of the guards stationed outside his door. Sensory overload is the most common side effect during the initial integration phase. Wesley whipped around. Ilara stood by the heavy velvet drapes that covered a massive floor-to-ceiling window. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't heard her enter. She was just there, a ghost in a white medical coat. "Integration phase," Wesley repeated, his voice sounding entirely too loud in his own ears. He took a step back, putting distance between himself and the vampire scientist. "Integration of what? You said I was healed." "You were reconstructed, Wesley," Ilara corrected, her silver eyes scanning him with the detached fascination of a biologist observing a microbe under a slide. "Princess Alyssa introduced a staggering volume of sovereign blood into your collapsing circulatory system. It didn't just patch your wounds, it rewrote you." "Rewrote me," Wesley muttered, dragging a hand down his face. His skin felt overly sensitive to his own touch. "So what am I? Some kind of vampire now? I don't feel a sudden urge to bite anyone's neck." "You are not kindred," Elara said dismissively. "You are still mortal. You still draw breath. The sun will not burn you, and our hungers are not your own. But you are no longer entirely human either. You are a revenant, a blood sworn. It is an archaic condition. I have only read of it in texts predating the Industrial Revolution." She crossed the room, pulling a small silver penlight from her pocket. "Follow the light," she commanded. Wesley complied, too exhausted to fight her. As she clicked the light on, his pupils didn't just contract. They snapped shut like camera shutters, instinctively protecting his retinas. "Fascinating," Elara murmured, turning off the light. "Your muscular density has increased by roughly 300%. Your auditory and olfactory nerves are hypersensitive. The sovereign blood in your veins acts as an adrenaline analog, but permanently." "Okay, great. I'm Captain America with a fanged sugar mama," Wesley said, his military-bred sarcasm surfacing as a shield against the rising tide of panic. "When do I get to leave?" Elara stopped writing on her tablet. She looked up at him, her expression sobering. "You do not seem to comprehend the gravity of the princess's actions. The Night Court is not a monolith. It is a fragile alliance of predator houses. Alyssa's uncle, Silas, lord of the Daybreak faction, has spent a decade looking for an excuse to declare her unfit for the throne. And binding herself to a human grease monkey is the excuse?" "Precisely," Elara said softly. "The hunters who attacked you were a corporate mercenary outfit, heavily funded and equipped with illicit plasma tech. They were hired by Silas to assassinate Alyssa before she could formally ascend next month. By saving her, you ruined a multi-million-dollar coup." Wesley swallowed hard. "And by saving me? Alyssa fractured the oldest law of our kind," Elara finished. "Silas now has political leverage to challenge her directly. You are not a guest here, Wesley. You are the match that is about to ignite a civil war." Before Wesley could respond, the oak doors swung open again. Genevieve strode in, looking even more severe than before. She carried a stack of folded dark clothing over her arm. She tossed them onto the foot of the bed with obvious disdain. "Dress!" she barked. "Her Highness requires you in the lower armory." "The armory?" Wesley asked, picking up a heavy, reinforced Kevlar weave shirt. "Why?" Genevieve's crimson eyes narrowed. "Because if you are going to be the reason our court burns, the least you can do is learn how not to die immediately when the shooting starts." The Night Court's sanctum didn't look like a Gothic castle, much to Wesley's surprise. Once Genevieve led him out of the aristocratic living quarters, the architecture shifted rapidly into hyper-modern brutalism. They descended via a glass elevator, down a shaft carved directly into the bedrock of what Wesley guessed was the city's foundation. He was wearing the tactical clothes Genevieve had provided: dark, abrasion-resistant cargo pants, heavy combat boots, and the Kevlar weave shirt that fit his newly expanded shoulders perfectly. The armory was massive, a sprawling underground cavern lit by harsh, sterile LED strips. Racks of weaponry lined the walls, some of it Wesley recognized: high-caliber assault rifles, tactical shotguns, and precision sniper systems. But a terrifying amount of it was completely alien to him. Sleek, matte black energy weapons, vibrating kinetic blades, and silver-plated munitions. Alyssa was standing at a heavy steel workbench in the center of the room. She had shed the burgundy suit jacket and was wearing a fitted black top and shoulder holsters. The corporate queen look was gone. The warrior had taken its place. She looked up as Wesley approached. For a brief second, the tension in her jaw softened, her amethyst eyes sweeping over him in his new gear. The bond between them hummed, a low, electric vibration that Wesley felt in his teeth. "You look better," Alyssa said. "I feel like I'm vibrating," Wesley admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ilara said my biology is different now." "It had to be," Alyssa said softly, her gaze dropping to the silver scars visible at his collar. "The hunters won't stop. Silas knows you survived. To him, you are a political weapon to be used against me. He will send better men." "Let them come," Genevieve sneered from the doorway, her arms crossed. "They are mortal trash, playing with stolen toys." "Those toys melted my ribs, Genevieve," Wesley pointed out. He walked over to the workbench, his mechanic's eyes immediately drawn to the dismantled weapon laid out on the metal surface. It was a plasma rifle, identical to the ones the hunters had used in his garage. It was in pieces, the magnetic coils exposed, the thermal venting system stripped away. "We recovered it from the ashes of your garage," Alyssa explained, watching him closely. "Our engineers have been trying to reverse engineer the cooling matrix. It overheats after 3 consecutive blasts. We need to know how they bypassed the thermal lock." Wesley didn't ask for permission. His hands moved on instinct. He reached down, picking up the scorched emitter nozzle. The metal was alien, but engineering was a universal language. Pressure, heat, release. It was just an engine, albeit one designed to burn people alive instead of turning wheels. "They didn't bypass it," Wesley muttered, his enhanced vision picking up the microfractures in the housing unit. He grabbed a pair of fine-point pliers from a nearby tool rack. "They rigged a secondary heat sink. See this valve? It's bleeding excess plasma into the stock. It's a suicide rig." Genevieve scoffed, stepping forward. "Do not pretend to understand syndicate weaponry, human. Our finest armorers. Your finest armorers don't know what it's like to drive a car with a blown radiator." Wesley cut her off, twisting the valve with a sharp flick of his wrist. He pulled out a scorched, cylindrical piece of metal and tossed it onto the bench. It clattered loudly. "They're dumping heat manually. The weapon doesn't have a safety limit. If the shooter holds the trigger for more than 5 seconds, the entire rifle becomes a localized pipe bomb." Silence fell over the armory. Alyssa picked up the scorched cylinder, her eyes wide with sudden realization. They weren't mercenaries. They were zealots. Silas sent men willing to die just to ensure the kill. Genevieve's expression hardened, her disdain for Wesley momentarily eclipsed by tactical concern. "If Silas is utilizing suicide squads, our perimeter wards are insufficient. We need to recalibrate the—" A shrill, deafening klaxon cut her off. The harsh white LEDs in the armory instantly snapped off, plunging the massive room into darkness. A second later, emergency crimson strobes began to pulse, bathing the room in a bloody, violent rhythm. "Breach, Sector 4. Breach, Sector 4. An automated voice, cold and synthetic, echoed over the intercom. "Sector 4, Genevieve hissed, drawing her curved sword in a single, fluid motion. The steel hissed against the scabbard. "That's the upper concourse. How did they bypass the kinetic shielding?" "They didn't bypass it," Alyssa said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into something primal and terrifying. Her fangs fully elongated, catching the red strobe lights. "Someone let them in." A massive explosion shook the ceiling above them, raining dust and loose concrete onto the workbench. Wesley's heightened senses went into overdrive. He could smell the distinct, acrid scent of ozone bleeding through the ventilation shafts. Plasma. "They're not trying to assassinate you quietly anymore," Wesley yelled over the blaring alarm, his heart hammering against his chest. Yet, his hands weren't shaking. The sovereign blood in his veins was flooding his system with icy, calculated focus. He reached across the workbench, bypassing the complex energy weapons he didn't know how to shoot. Instead, his hands closed around the cold, heavy steel of a custom-built, pump-action combat shotgun. It was loaded with heavy, silver slug munitions. Human tech. Brutal. Reliable. He pumped the slide. The loud clack-clack cut through the noise of the alarms. Alyssa looked at him, her glowing amethyst eyes burning with a mixture of fear and ferocious pride. "Genevieve, secure the primary elevator," Alyssa commanded, drawing a sleek, silver sidearm from her holster. "Wesley, stay behind me." "Not a chance in hell," Wesley said, stepping up beside the vampire princess. The connection between them flared, a silent, mutual understanding. He had died for her once. He wasn't going to let her face the fire alone again. The heavy steel doors of the armory groaned in protest as a concussive blast hit them from the other side. "They are trying to blow the lock," Genevieve said, her voice deathly calm. She stood directly in front of the doors, her sword angled downward, her body coiled like a striking viper. "They are using breaching charges, heavy munitions." "Then we don't wait for them to finish," Alyssa ordered. She raised a small, hand-held detonator she had grabbed from the workbench. "We control the entry." Wesley braced the stock of the shotgun against his shoulder, aiming dead center at the reinforced doors. His breath was steady. It was a surreal realization. The mortal terror that should have paralyzed him was completely absent, replaced by the predator's instinct gifted to him by Alyssa's blood. "On my mark," Alyssa said, her thumb hovering over the button. 3, 2, 1. Mark. She triggered the localized defense charges built into the doorframe. The explosion didn't push inward. It blew outward into the corridor. The heavy steel doors were blasted off their hinges, violently crushing whoever was standing on the other side. Smoke and dust billowed into the armory, thick and choking. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, the remaining attackers opened fire. Violet plasma bolts tore through the doorway, searing the air and striking the weapon racks. Sparks showered down like fireworks. "Down!" Alyssa yelled, though Wesley was already moving. His reflexes were terrifying. He dropped to one knee, sliding under the arc of a plasma bolt that would have taken his head off a day ago. He aimed into the thickest part of the smoke and pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening thunderclap of kinetic force. The heavy silver slug tore through the haze and hit a target. A man in tactical gear was thrown backward with brutal, bone-shattering force, his plasma rifle clattering to the floor. "One down!" Wesley shouted, pumping the shotgun. Genevieve didn't use a gun. As the initial volley paused, she blurred into motion. Wesley's enhanced eyes could barely track her. She launched herself through the smoke, a streak of black leather and silver steel. He heard the sickening sound of a blade parting flesh, followed by a choked gurgle. "Clear the corridor!" Alyssa commanded, firing 3 rapid shots from her sidearm. Each bullet found a mark, precise and lethal. Wesley moved out of the armory, covering Alyssa's flank. The hallway was a scene of utter devastation. 3 hunters lay dead on the floor, their armor useless against the sheer force of the Night Court's defenders. But more were pouring down the stairwell at the far end of the hall. "There's too many of them!" Wesley yelled over the din of weapons fire. He fired again, shattering the knee of an advancing mercenary. "If they have a localized explosive like you said, they'll bring this whole ceiling down on us." "We need to reach the surface access tunnels," Alyssa said, grabbing his shoulder. Her touch sent a jolt of raw energy through him. "This way." She dragged him down a side corridor, Genevieve covering their retreat, her sword a whirlwind of deflection and lethal strikes. They ran. Wesley kept pace with Alyssa effortlessly, a physical feat that would have left him breathless and lagging behind normally. They navigated a labyrinth of grey concrete corridors, the sounds of the battle echoing ominously behind them. Suddenly, a massive figure stepped out from an intersecting hallway, blocking their path. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wore a tailored suit, much like Alyssa's usual attire, but his face was grotesque, pale, heavily scarred, and his eyes burned with a sickly, jaundiced yellow light. He was a vampire, but massive, built like a brick wall. "Princess," the giant rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Lord Silas sends his regards." He lunged not at Alyssa, but straight at Wesley. Wesley raised the shotgun, but the vampire was too fast. A massive hand grabbed the barrel of the gun and crushed it like it was made of tin foil. With a casual backhand, the giant struck Wesley in the chest. The force of the blow lifted Wesley entirely off his feet. He flew backward, crashing through a wooden door and landing hard on the floor of what looked like an old maintenance closet. Pain exploded in his ribs, the exact same ribs that had been melted 2 days ago. He coughed, tasting copper. "Wesley!" Alyssa screamed. He heard the clash of a struggle outside the room, the tearing of masonry. Wesley forced himself up. The silver scars on his chest were burning, pulsing with a furious, white-hot heat. He could feel the sovereign blood repairing the microfractures in his bones almost instantaneously. The pain faded, replaced by pure, blinding rage. He didn't have a gun. But he was a mechanic. He knew how to break things. Wesley burst out of the closet just as the giant had Alyssa pinned by the throat against the wall, her feet dangling off the ground. She was clawing at his grip, her fangs bared in a desperate snarl. Wesley didn't shout. He didn't warn the attacker. He sprinted, his boots gaining impossible traction on the floor, and launched himself into the air. He tackled the giant vampire from the side, wrapping his arm around the creature's thick neck. The sheer kinetic force of Wesley's new density hit the vampire like a freight train, knocking him away from Alyssa and sending both men crashing to the floor. The giant roared, thrashing wildly. He tried to throw Wesley off, but Wesley locked his legs around the vampire's torso, his mechanic's grip clamping down on the creature's windpipe. "Get off me, mortal!" the giant snarled, his heavy fists pounding into Wesley's sides. Every blow felt like a hammer strike, but Wesley held on. He squeezed, drawing on every ounce of the unnatural strength pumping through his veins. He heard something crack in the vampire's neck. Before the giant could strike again, Alyssa was there. She didn't use a weapon. She knelt beside the struggling behemoth, her eyes glowing a terrifying absolute violet. She plunged her hand directly into the giant's chest, her nails extending into razor-sharp talons that effortlessly pierced the flesh and shattered the sternum. The giant went rigid, his yellow eyes widening in shock. Alyssa pulled her hand back, slick with dark blood. The massive vampire crumbled into ash beneath Wesley, dissolving into a heap of grey dust in a matter of seconds. Wesley collapsed backward onto the floor, gasping for air. His clothes were covered in ash. Alyssa fell to her knees beside him. Her regal composure was entirely gone. She was breathing heavily, her hands stained with blood. She looked down at him, her eyes searching his face frantically for fatal injuries. "Are you?" she started, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm fine," Wesley groaned, sitting up and brushing the ash off his chest. He looked at her, seeing past the terrifying display of power she had just unleashed. He just saw the woman he had promised to protect. "I'm fine, Alyssa." She stared at him, the use of her first name hanging in the air between them. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the heavy, undeniable gravity of the bond tethering their lives together. She reached out, gently wiping a streak of soot from his cheek with her thumb. Her touch was impossibly soft. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You could have been killed." Again. "I told you," Wesley said, his voice low, his eyes locking onto hers. "I fix broken things. I'm not letting them break you." The alarms continued to blare in the distance, but in the quiet ruin of the hallway, the only thing Wesley could hear was the synchronized racing rhythm of their two hearts. The surface access tunnel spat them out into an alleyway, drowning in the same relentless storm that had washed Alyssa into Wesley's life 48 hours prior. The contrast was violently jarring. Down in the night court, everything had been velvet, polished stone, and sterile steel. Up here, the city smelled like wet asphalt, rotting garbage, and exhaust fumes. Wesley took a deep breath, the familiar grit of the human world settling his racing pulse. Genevieve kicked the heavy iron grate back over the tunnel exit. The rain immediately plastered her platinum hair to her skull. She glared out at the slick, empty street. We cannot stay in the open. Silas's men will have secured the perimeter above the sanctum. They are hunting us. Alyssa stood beside Wesley, the heavy tactical fabric of her clothes darkening with the rain. Without the backdrop of her subterranean palace, she looked remarkably, dangerously fragile. But the amethyst fire in her eyes remained unquenched. "We need a safe house," Alyssa said, her voice tight. "A place entirely disconnected from the syndicate network. Anywhere I own will be compromised." Wesley wiped the water from his eyes, his newly sharpened mind cycling through the geography of the city with terrifying speed. He didn't just remember streets, he mapped traffic patterns, blind spots, and industrial dead zones. "I know a place," Wesley said. "South side, near the docks. It's an old salvage yard owned by a guy who doesn't use banks, cell phones, or the internet. It's a ghost grid." "A junkyard," Genevieve scoffed, the word dripping with aristocratic venom. "You want to hide the heir to the night court in a pile of rusted mortal garbage?" Wesley turned to her, his patience finally snapping. He closed the distance between them, ignoring the warning growl that vibrated in her chest. "Listen to me," Wesley said, his voice low enough to cut through the rain. "Your sterile, billion-dollar fortress down there just got breached by a guy in a suit and a bunch of mercenaries with suicide rigs. Your tech failed. Your wards failed. Out here, in the rust and the rain, this is my world, and right now, my world is the only thing keeping you breathing." Genevieve's hand drifted toward the hilt of her sword, but Alyssa stepped between them. "Enough," Alyssa commanded softly. She looked up at Wesley, the rain trailing down her pale cheeks like glass tears. "Lead the way, Wesley." It took them 40 tense minutes of navigating back alleys and chain-link fences to reach the salvage yard. The area was a sprawling maze of crushed sedans, rusted shipping containers, and towering stacks of stripped engine blocks. It looked like a graveyard for the industrial age. Wesley bypassed the chained front gate, leading them through a hidden gap in the corrugated iron fencing. He didn't bother trying to wake the owner. Marcus would likely shoot first if someone knocked on his trailer door at this hour. Instead, Wesley guided them toward an abandoned, hollowed-out fuselage of an old commercial cargo plane resting atop a bed of crushed cars. It was dry, defensible, and utterly off the grid. Once inside the cavernous metal hull, the drumming of the rain became a hollow, metallic echo. It was freezing, but Wesley barely felt the cold. The sovereign blood was a furnace in his chest. Genevieve instantly moved to the open cargo doors, standing watch in the shadows, her eyes scanning the darkened yard. Alyssa walked further into the fuselage, collapsing onto a rotting crate. She buried her face in her hands. For the first time since he had met her, the regal mask slipped entirely. Her shoulders shook, not with cold, but with the crushing weight of the betrayal she had just survived. Wesley approached her slowly, giving her space. He sat on an overturned, rusted barrel a few feet away. "You're shivering," he noted quietly. Alyssa dropped her hands. Her eyes were rimmed with a faint, exhausted crimson. "I am not cold, Wesley. I am empty. The sanctum was my home. The guards who died in that hallway were my people. Who let them in? Wesley asked, the mechanical part of his brain trying to diagnose the failure in her defenses. You said someone bypassed the kinetic shielding. Who had the access? Alyssa stared at the rusted floor pan of the aircraft. Very few. Genevieve, myself. She paused, her jaw tightening so hard, Wesley heard the enamel of her fangs grind. And Ilara. Wesley felt a cold spike of realization. The pristine scientist, the woman who had meticulously examined him, analyzed his blood, tested his reflexes with the cold detachment of a vivisectionist. Ilara, Wesley breathed. She was tracking my vitals. She knew exactly how fast my heart was beating, how dense my muscles were. He looked at his own hands, clenching them into fists. She wasn't just checking my health, Alyssa. She was running diagnostics on the bond, searching for a weakness. Alyssa looked up, her expression shattering. Before she could speak, a low, unnatural hum vibrated through the metal hull of the plane. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like the charging coils of a massive capacitor. Genevieve spun around from the cargo doors, her sword drawn. We are compromised. Wesley was on his feet in an instant. The faint metallic taste of ozone flooded his hypersensitive palate. Plasma. How? Wesley demanded, grabbing a heavy rusted iron pipe from the floor. I left my phone in the ashes of my garage. We don't have trackers. A voice echoed from the darkness of the scrapyard outside. It was smooth, cultured, and carried effortlessly over the roar of the rain. You don't need a tracker, mechanic, when the quarry shines like a beacon in the dark. Alyssa froze. The color drained completely from her already pale face. She whispered a single name, filled with centuries of dread. Silas. He stepped into the clearing beneath the rusted nose of the airplane, illuminated by the harsh, sweeping beam of a security floodlight Wesley hadn't noticed turning on. Silas did not look like a monster. He looked like an aristocrat attending an opera. He wore a bespoke midnight blue overcoat, unbothered by the torrential rain that seemed to bend around him, leaving him entirely dry. His hair was silver, slicked back, and his eyes were a terrifying, fathomless black void. Beside him stood Ilara, holding her sleek tablet, shielded by a black umbrella held by one of 4 heavily armored mercenaries. Uncle, Alyssa said, stepping out of the shadows of the fuselage, her voice steadying through sheer, desperate willpower. Alyssa, my dear, Silas smiled, though the expression never reached his empty eyes. You have caused quite a mess in the lower levels. The cleanup will be astronomical. You breached the sanctum, Alyssa countered, her fists clenching at her sides. You broke the treaty of the factions. The council will have your head. Silas chuckled, a dry, papery sound. The council will mourn your tragic demise at the hands of radical corporate hunters. They will crown me in your memory. His black eyes shifted, locking onto Wesley. The sheer malice in his gaze felt like a physical weight pressing against Wesley's chest. And I see you brought your pet. Genevieve dropped from the fuselage, landing silently in the mud between Alyssa and Silas. You will not touch her, traitor. Genevieve, always the loyal hound. Silas sighed dismissively. Ilara, if you would explain to our guests why their defiance is pointless. Ilara stepped forward, her silver eyes entirely devoid of guilt as she looked at Alyssa. The princess acted on emotion, not logic. By initiating a sovereign bloodbind to save a mortal, she didn't just break the law. She tethered her own biological immortality to a fragile, fleshy anchor. Wesley felt his stomach drop. He looked at Alyssa. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Silas, her breathing shallow. What does that mean? Wesley demanded, stepping to Alyssa's side. Ilara tapped her tablet. It means, mechanic, that the bond is bidirectional. She gave you her strength, yes. But in return, she adopted your vulnerability. If your mortal heart stops beating, her sovereign immortality shatters. She will be rendered entirely powerless for a full lunar cycle. A mortal queen. The realization hit Wesley like a sledgehammer. Silas hadn't sent the hunters to kill Alyssa in the sanctum. He had sent them to kill Wesley. Without Wesley, Alyssa was defenseless. Without Wesley, Silas could take the throne without firing a single shot at a royal. "Kill the mechanic," Silas ordered smoothly, turning his back on them. "Leave the princess to me." The 4 armored mercenaries raised their plasma rifles. Wesley didn't hesitate. This was his junkyard. He grabbed the heavy iron pipe and hurled it not at the soldiers but straight up, shattering the glass casing of the massive halogen floodlight above them. The yard plunged into absolute pitch darkness. In the brief second of confusion, Wesley sprinted. He didn't run away. He dove under the rusted chassis of a crushed pickup truck, just as the first plasma bolts seared the space he had occupied. "Spread out! Find him with thermals!" a mercenary shouted. Wesley crawled through the mud and twisted metal, his enhanced sensors turning the junkyard into a 3-dimensional tactical map. He could smell the ozone bleeding from their rifles. He could hear their heavy boots squelching in the mud. He could hear Genevieve clashing blades with 2 invisible combatants near the plane. He reached the base of a towering, rusted crane. He knew this machine. Marcus used it to crush engine blocks. Wesley climbed the greasy, rain-slicked ladder with terrifying speed, his new muscles propelling him upward like a coiled spring. He reached the operator's cab. It was dead, the power cut years ago. But Wesley didn't need a key. He needed a circuit. He ripped the control panel open with his bare hands, tearing the thick gauge wires from their housing. He pressed the copper fibers together. A spark showered his hands, and the massive diesel generator at the base of the crane roared to life, coughing black smoke into the rain. Below him, 2 mercenaries spun around, aiming their rifles at the cab. "Got him! Up high!" Wesley didn't flinch. He grabbed the heavy joystick, slamming it forward. The crane didn't lower a hook. It lowered a 5-ton industrial electromagnet, completely unpowered, right over the mercenaries' heads. Before they could fire, Wesley slammed the power switch on the control console. The magnet hummed to life with a deafening screech. The mercenaries wore tactical gear lined with heavy steel plating to disperse kinetic impacts. The moment the magnet activated, they were violently yanked upward, screaming as their armor pinned them helplessly to the massive metal disc, their plasma rifles ripping out of their hands and snapping to the magnet surface. Wesley threw the crane into reverse, swinging the boom out over a towering pile of crushed, rusted sedans, and killed the power. The magnet died. The mercenaries and their weapons plummeted 40 feet down into the jagged metal ruins below. Wesley let out a ragged breath, turning his attention back to the clearing. He had neutralized 2. But as he looked down, his enhanced vision pierced the darkness. Genevieve was on her knees in the mud, clutching a bleeding wound in her side. Ilara stood over her with a silver combat knife, and Silas had Alyssa by the throat. Silas moved with a speed that made Genevieve look lethargic. He held Alyssa pinned against the rusted side of the airplane fuselage. His black eyes were wide, manic, drinking in her helplessness. "You were always too soft for the throne, niece," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating through the metal. He raised a hand, his nails extending into brutal, jagged talons. "A sovereign does not bleed for cattle." Wesley felt a sudden, terrifying compression in his own chest. His breath hitched. It wasn't his pain, it was hers. The blood bond was screaming, warning him that the anchor was about to break. Wesley didn't bother climbing down the ladder. He threw himself out of the crane's cab, dropping 20 feet and landing in a crouch on top of a crushed shipping container. His knees absorbed the kinetic shock with a loud crack, but the pain vanished instantly, drowned out by the sovereign adrenaline. He sprinted across the tops of the metal wreckage, leaping the gaps like a phantom. He needed a weapon, something Silas couldn't shrug off. He landed near the massive diesel generator that powered the crane. Thick, heavy-duty jumper cables, thick as pythons, lay coiled in the mud, used by Marcus to jump-start commercial bulldozers. Silas pulled his arm back, ready to drive his talons into Alyssa's heart. "Hey!" Wesley roared, his voice tearing raw from his throat. Silas paused, turning his head slowly. He looked at Wesley with mild annoyance. "The cockroach survives the boot." "Pity." Wesley didn't charge him. He knew he couldn't beat Silas in a fistfight. The ancient vampire was too fast, too durable. Instead, Wesley grabbed the positive lead of the heavy jumper cables. He ripped the thick rubber insulation off with his fangs, exposing the braided copper wire. Silas tilted his head. "What are you doing, mortal?" Wesley looked at Alyssa. Her amethyst eyes were wide, panicked, pleading with him to run. He felt the connection between them, a hot, pulsing wire of life force tethering his beating heart to her immortal soul. He realized what Elara had missed in her calculations. The bond was bidirectional. She took his vulnerability, yes, but he was a conduit for her power. "I'm an obstruction," Wesley said coldly. "Clear it." He didn't throw the cable at Silas. Silas would have dodged it. Wesley jammed the exposed, sparking copper wire directly into his own chest, right over the web of silver scars. The diesel generator surged. 5,000 amps of raw, unmitigated industrial electricity flooded into Wesley's body. A human would have been instantly vaporized, their organs cooked to ash in a millisecond. But Wesley wasn't just human anymore. The sovereign blood in his veins acted as a hyperconductive superfluid. It didn't burn him. It absorbed the voltage, amplifying it, turning his entire skeletal structure into a living, breathing capacitor. Wesley screamed, not in pain, but from the sheer, catastrophic volume of energy expanding inside him. His eyes glowed a blinding, terrifying violet. The silver scars on his chest ignited, shining like a dying star through his wet shirt. Alyssa gasped, her body going entirely rigid as the feedback from the bond hit her. Silas dropped her, stumbling backward, his black eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror as he realized what Wesley had become. Wesley threw his hands forward. The electricity didn't spark. It erupted. A localized EMP of raw, violet lightning arced from Wesley's hands, tearing through the rain and slamming directly into Silas's chest. The ancient vampire shrieked, a sound of tearing metal and burning flesh. The voltage locked his muscles, freezing him in place, cooking his ancient blood from the inside out. The smell of ozone and burning copper overtook the stench of the scrapyard. Wesley held the current for 5 agonizing seconds, feeling his own bones beginning to vibrate into dust under the strain, before he finally dropped the cable. He collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming, his skin smoking in the cold rain. Silas stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his bespoke coat charred, his flesh smoking. He took one shuddering step forward, his black eyes fixing on Wesley with pure hatred. But the paralysis had given Alyssa the opening she needed. She moved faster than lightning. She materialized behind Silas, her face a mask of absolute, sovereign fury. With one swift, brutal motion, she drove her hand straight through Silas's back, her talons bursting through his sternum, clutching his blackened, ruined heart. "The crown belongs to me," Alyssa whispered into his ear. She crushed it. Silas crumbled into a mountain of grey ash, washing away instantly in the torrential rain. silence crashed back over the junkyard, broken only by the hum of the idling generator and the steady drum of the storm. Genevieve had Elara pinned to the mud, the traitor's tablet shattered beside her. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their employer vaporized, had fled into the night. Alyssa didn't look at them. She rushed to Wesley, dropping to her knees in the mud beside him. She grabbed his smoking jacket, pulling him upright. Her hands were shaking violently. "Wesley," she breathed, her amethyst eyes searching his soot-stained face. "Wesley, look at me. Is your heart beating? Look at me." Wesley coughed, a weak, rattling sound. He leaned heavily against her, feeling the cold silk of her tactical shirt beneath his cheek. The sovereign blood in his veins was rapidly cooling, repairing the massive electrical burns with terrifying efficiency. He reached up, his grease-stained, soot-covered hand resting gently against her cheek. "Still ticking," Wesley rasped, a tired, lopsided grin breaking through the dirt. "Told you, I've got good parts." Alyssa let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She didn't care about the mud, or the blood, or the ash. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck, holding him with a fierce, possessive grip that promised she would never let him go. Dawn was beginning to break over the rusted spires of the salvage yard, casting a pale, grey light over the ruins. The night court had survived the eclipse, and as Wesley held the vampire queen in the mud and the rain, he knew his life in the garage was gone forever. He was the mechanic who had fixed a broken crown, and he was never leaving her side again. Wesley's journey from a solitary mechanic to the blood-sworn anchor of a vampire queen proves that true power doesn't lie in ancient immortality, but in the profoundly human willingness to bleed for what you love. His selfless courage, combined with Alyssa's strength, forged a bond that saved a kingdom. Sometimes, the most broken things, whether a rusted engine or a fractured crown, just need the right hands to fix them. If this gritty, high-stakes romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic stories. Let me know in the comments which twist caught you off guard the most.